Cowboy Easter mail-order bride arrives with a hidden talent that saves his struggling ranch. The wind moved like a restless spirit across Caleb Turner's land, dragging dust along with it in thin, ghostly trails. It whispered through broken fence posts and rattled the loose boards of the barn as if the ranch itself was trying to speak, but had long since lost the strength to be heard. Caleb stood alone at the far edge of his property, boots planted in dry, cracked earth. The soil beneath him had once been rich. He remembered that much. Back when his father was alive. Back when the land responded to hard work and prayer like it was meant to. Now, it felt like nothing listened anymore. He removed his hat slowly, running a rough hand through his hair as he stared out over what remained of his cattle. They were scattered thinly across the pasture, ribs showing, their movements sluggish. 42, he muttered under his breath. That's all that's left. There had been over 100 just 2 years ago. 2 years. That's all it took for everything to fall apart. A dry season turned into a drought. A drought turned into debt. And debt, well, that turned into something Caleb couldn't outrun no matter how hard he worked. Behind him, the old windmill creaked loudly, its slow, uneven turning doing little more than mock him. The well beneath it had nearly given out weeks ago. Caleb sighed deeply, his breath heavy with exhaustion. I did everything right, he said aloud, though there was no one around to hear him. Worked sunup to sundown, didn't waste, didn't gamble, didn't quit. His voice faltered. So why is it still not enough? The question lingered in the empty air. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing more. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he bowed his head. Lord, he began, his voice rough, unfamiliar with the shape of prayer. It had been a long time since he'd spoken to God. Not properly. Not honestly. Not since the day they buried his father on the far side of the ranch. The one man who had known how to keep both the land and Caleb's faith alive. Caleb swallowed hard. I don't know if you're still listening to me. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past him like a quiet presence. But I don't have anywhere else to go, he continued. I'm out of answers. His fingers tightened around the brim of his hat. I can't lose this place, he whispered. It's all I've got left of him. Of everything. A pause. Then, a softer, more broken, I'm tired, Lord. The confession hung heavier than anything else he'd said. For a moment, it felt like the world held its breath. But nothing changed. No sudden rain, no distant sign, no voice from heaven. Just the same dry wind. Caleb let out a hollow laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, figured as much. He placed his hat back on and turned toward the house, a small, weathered structure that looked like it was holding on by sheer stubbornness. Halfway there, his gaze shifted to the mailbox near the road. Empty. It had been empty for weeks. Caleb stared at it longer than he meant to. Months ago, on a cold, desperate night, he had written a letter. Not something he ever imagined doing, not something his pride had easily allowed. But desperation has a way of humbling a man, and he had signed up for a mail-order bride. Even thinking it now made his jaw tighten. Pathetic, he muttered under his breath. He hadn't done it for love. Didn't even believe in that kind of thing anymore. No, he needed help. Someone to keep the house running. Someone to bring structure. Maybe even someone who could bring a sense of life back into a place that had grown quiet and hollow. The agency had written back weeks later. Her name was Eliza Hartwell. They said she was kind, faithful, hardworking, everything a good wife should be. Caleb had read the letter twice, then folded it and tucked it away. He hadn't allowed himself to hope. And now? Well, she hadn't come. No letter, no notice, no explanation, just silence. He couldn't blame her. Oh, a woman like that. She probably took one look at the description of this place and decided she wanted something better. Something alive. Caleb exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging. "Smart choice," he said quietly. He turned away from the mailbox and continued toward the house, his boots crunching against the dry ground. Inside, the air was still. The kind of stillness that comes from too much absence. He set his hat down on the table and sank into a chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His eyes drifted to the far wall. There, hanging slightly crooked, was an old wooden cross. It had belonged to his father. Caleb stared at it for a long time. "You used to say God provides," he murmured, "that he sees ahead, makes a way." His jaw tightened. "Oh, feels like he missed this one." The words were sharp, but they didn't bring relief. Only silence. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face in his hands. Outside, the wind howled louder, slamming the barn doors somewhere in the distance. A hollow, echoing bang. Over and over again. Like something unfinished. Like something waiting. Caleb closed his eyes. "I can't fix this alone," he admitted, barely audible. It wasn't quite a prayer, but it was close. And somewhere far down the road, though he didn't know it yet, an answer was already on its way. Easter morning came quietly. No celebration, no church bells, no voices raised in song, just the pale glow of sunrise stretching across a tired land. Caleb Turner was already awake, seated on the worn wooden steps outside his farmhouse. A tin cup of black coffee rested in his hand, long gone cold. He hadn't bothered to drink it. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. Not because he expected anything, but because he didn't. Easter used to mean something. He remembered his father waking him before dawn, insisting they give thanks before touching a single chore. They'd stand right there in the yard, heads bowed, the air crisp with morning dew, and his father would say, "He rose so we could rise too, son. Don't ever forget that." Caleb swallowed hard at the memory. "Feels like I stayed buried," he muttered. A faint sound broke the silence. Distant at first, rhythmic, wheels against dirt. Caleb frowned, lifting his head slightly. Visitors didn't come out this way. Not anymore. The sound grew louder. A stagecoach. His brow furrowed as he stood, setting the untouched coffee aside. He stepped off the porch, boots hitting the ground with quiet weight, eyes narrowing against the growing sunlight. The coach appeared over the rise like something out of another world, cleaner, more put together than anything that belonged on this road. Caleb's first instinct was suspicion. His second, something he didn't want to name. Hope. "No," he said under his breath. "Couldn't be." The coach rolled closer, dust trailing behind it like a veil. The horses slowed, then stopped just a few yards from the gate. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to pause. Even the wind stilled. Caleb's heart gave one heavy, uncertain beat. Then the door opened. A boot stepped down. Not delicate, not hesitant. Firm. Grounded. Then she emerged. Eliza Hartwell. She didn't look like what Caleb had imagined. Not even close. There was no fragility in her posture. No timid uncertainty in her movements. She stood tall, her shoulders squared, not in defiance, but in quiet confidence. The morning light caught the edges of her face, revealing eyes that were alert, observant, alive. She wore a simple dress, practical more than decorative, with a coat suited for travel. Dust clung to the hem, but she didn't seem to notice, or care. In one hand, she carried a modest suitcase. In the other, strapped carefully at her side, was a wooden case. Not large, but clearly important. Caleb blinked, trying to reconcile the image before him with the one he had built in his mind. This wasn't a woman seeking rescue. This was someone who had already survived something. The driver cleared his throat. "So Miss Hartwell's stop." She nodded politely, then stepped fully onto the ground. Her boots met the dirt with quiet certainty. No hesitation. No second thoughts. Caleb found himself walking forward before he realized it, stopping a few feet from her. Up close, he noticed the faint lines of weariness on her face, but they didn't weaken her. If anything, they made her seem steady. Real. "You," he started, then paused, suddenly unsure of his own voice. "You're Eliza." She met his gaze directly. No shyness, no fluttering nerves, just calm recognition. "And you must be Caleb Turner." Her voice was soft, but it carried, like someone used to being heard without needing to raise it. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, glancing briefly at the coach, then back at her. "Didn't think you'd actually come." It wasn't meant to sound harsh, but it did. Eliza didn't flinch. "I gave my word," she said simply. "That still means something to me." The driver unloaded her suitcase and set it beside her, tipping his hat before climbing back onto the coach. "You folks take care now." With a crack of the reins, the horses turned, and the coach began its journey back down the road, leaving behind a cloud of dust, and a silence that felt heavier than before. Caleb shifted his weight. "Well," he said awkwardly, gesturing toward the ranch, "this is it." Eliza turned slowly, taking it all in. The broken fence, the thinning cattle, the dry, struggling land, the tired barn leaning slightly to one side. Her gaze lingered, not with judgment, but with careful attention, like she was studying it, understanding it. Caleb watched her closely, bracing himself, and waiting for the reaction he expected. Disappointment, regret, maybe even the words, "I made a mistake." But they didn't come. Instead, Eliza took a slow breath, and then looked back at him. There was something different in her expression now. Not shock, not pity. Recognition. "I see," she said quietly. Caleb frowned slightly. "You see what?" She hesitated for just a moment, like she was choosing her words carefully. "Why God sent me here." The statement caught him off guard. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "God, huh?" he muttered. "You might want to lower your expectations." Eliza didn't respond to the sarcasm. She simply adjusted her grip on the wooden case. "I don't believe in accidents," she said, "especially not on Easter." Caleb glanced at the sky instinctively, then back at her. "You picked a hard place to test that belief." Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. "I didn't come for easy, Mr. Turner." He studied her for a long moment. There was no bluff in her, no pretending, just quiet certainty. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that unsettled him more than doubt ever could. He grabbed her suitcase before she could protest. "Come on," he said, turning toward the house. "No point standing out here all day." Eliza followed without hesitation. As they walked, the wind picked up again, but this time it felt different. Less like a warning, more like a shift. Caleb glanced back once, just briefly. Eliza was looking across the land again, but this time there was something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Not concern, not fear, possibility. And though Caleb wouldn't admit it, not yet, something deep inside him stirred. A fragile, unfamiliar thought. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. The first rooster crow came before dawn, but Caleb was already awake. Sleep had become something shallow and unreliable, like the well behind the barn. He lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, listening. There it was again. Movement in the kitchen. Soft, steady, intentional. Eliza. He exhaled slowly, pushing himself up from the bed. For a brief second, he forgot she was there, forgot that someone else now occupied the quiet spaces of the house that had been empty for far too long. Then reality settled back in. She hadn't left. That alone surprised him. Caleb pulled on his boots and stepped into the main room. The smell hit him first. Fresh bread. Well, he stopped in the doorway, caught off guard. Eliza stood near the small stove, sleeves rolled up, carefully pulling a loaf from the oven. The golden crust caught the early morning light, steam rising gently into the air. For a moment, Caleb didn't speak, didn't move. He couldn't remember the last time this place had smelled like anything other than dust and survival. "You're up early," he finally said. Eliza glanced over her shoulder, not startled. "I've been up for a while." Of course she had. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You don't have to do all this," he muttered. "This isn't exactly a proper situation yet." Eliza set the bread down carefully, then turned to face him. "I didn't come here for proper," she said calmly. "I came to build something that works." Caleb didn't reply, and he wasn't used to that kind of answer. She handed him a plate. "Eat. You'll need the strength." He hesitated, then took it. The first bite was almost enough to make him forget everything else. Almost. The sun climbed steadily as the day began, bringing with it heat that felt heavier than it should for that time of year. Caleb led Eliza out across the ranch, showing her what little remained. "This section used to be our strongest grazing land," he said, gesturing toward a wide stretch of brittle grass. "Now it's barely holding on." Eliza walked slowly beside him, her eyes scanning everything, not just looking, but observing. Caleb noticed it. She wasn't reacting like most people would. No complaints, no pity, just questions. "Why are the cattle concentrated here?" she asked. Caleb shrugged. "See, it's the only place with enough grass left." "And the other pastures?" "Dried out. No point moving them." Eliza knelt suddenly, brushing her fingers across the soil. She pressed it lightly, then let it fall back through her hand. "Has this land been rotated?" she asked. Caleb frowned. "Rotated?" "For grazing." He shook his head. "No, we've always used it this way." Eliza stood, her expression thoughtful. "Always doesn't always mean effective," she said quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "It worked before." Eliza met his gaze, not challenging but steady. "Before isn't now." The words hung between them, not harsh, but undeniable. Caleb looked away first. They continued walking. She asked about the well, about the feed, about the cattle's condition. Each answer Caleb gave seemed to confirm something she already suspected. Finally, he stopped near the old barn, leaning against one of its weathered beams. "All right," he said, folding his arms. "You've been asking a lot of questions." Eliza tilted her head slightly. "Is that a problem?" "Depends," Caleb replied. "You sound like someone who knows more than she's saying." A pause. The wind shifted, brushing past them. Eliza looked down briefly, then back at him. "I know enough to recognize when something's wrong," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving, for now." Caleb studied her, frustration flickering beneath the surface. "You expect me to just trust that?" Eliza didn't hesitate. "Yes." The boldness of it caught him off guard. He let out a short breath, shaking his head. "You're something else. You know that." "I've been called worse," she replied. For a split second, just a second, there was a hint of something deeper in her voice, something guarded. Caleb noticed it, but he didn't press. Not yet. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. The cattle moved slowly, their energy fading under the weight of it. Caleb stood at the edge of the pasture, watching them with a sinking feeling in his chest. "They won't last like this," he said quietly. Eliza stepped beside him. "No," she agreed. "They won't." There was no sugarcoating in her tone, no false comfort, just truth. Caleb ran a hand over his face. "The bank's already given me notice," he admitted. "Another month, maybe less, and they'll take everything." Eliza didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was softer. "Oh, why didn't you say that sooner?" Caleb gave a hollow laugh. "What difference would it make?" She looked at him, really looked at him. "Because it changes how we fight this." "We!" The word landed heavier than he expected. Caleb straightened slightly. "There is no we," he said. "Not yet." Eliza didn't argue, but she didn't back down either. "Then let me earn it." That evening, the sky turned a muted shade of gold as the sun began to set. Caleb sat at the small table inside, staring down at a stack of papers. The bank notice sitting right on top. Final warning. The words seemed louder in the quiet room. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion pressing in from all sides. "I'm going to lose everything," he muttered. The door creaked softly behind him. Eliza stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the fading light. But for a moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped inside. "Not if we change everything." Caleb didn't look up. "Change what?" he asked bitterly. "The weather? The land? My luck?" "All of it," she said. That made him lift his head. There was no hesitation in her eyes, no doubt, just conviction. Caleb let out a slow breath. "You really believe that?" Eliza nodded once. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Then Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're either very brave," he said, "or very naive." Eliza's lips curved slightly. "Or very prepared." The answer lingered. Caleb glanced briefly toward the wooden case resting near the wall, the one she hadn't opened since she arrived. Something about it had been quietly pulling at his attention. "What's in that thing, anyway?" he asked. Eliza followed his gaze, but for a moment her expression softened, then grew resolute. "You'll see soon enough," she said. Caleb narrowed his eyes slightly. "I don't like surprises." Eliza met his look evenly. "This one might save your ranch." That got his attention. But before he could respond, she turned slightly, her voice lowering just enough to carry a quiet weight. "Caleb, I didn't come here by accident." He stared at her. "And neither did you send for me by mistake." The room felt different suddenly. Charged, uncertain, hopeful, and dangerous at the same time. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then you better be right," he said. Eliza held his gaze. "I am." Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, not as harsh as before, but not yet kind either. The ranch was still on the edge, still fragile, is still one step away from collapse. But for the first time in a long while, it wasn't standing there alone. The morning came sharp and clear, the kind of dawn that made everything look more hopeful than it truly was. Caleb stepped out of the house, adjusting his hat as he scanned the land out of habit. The cattle were already moving, slow, tired, but moving. The windmill groaned in the distance, still fighting to pull water from a well that had nearly given up. But something felt different. There was movement near the edge of the field. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Eliza. She stood alone in the open pasture, the early light stretching long shadows behind her. The wooden case sat at her feet. For a moment, Caleb didn't move. He had been waiting for this. Was whatever she had been holding back, whatever she had brought with her, it was about to be revealed. He walked toward her, boots crunching against dry earth. "You're up even earlier than usual," he called out. Eliza didn't turn right away. "I needed the quiet," she replied. Caleb stopped a few feet away, folding his arms. "That thing again," he said, nodding toward the case. "You planning to tell me what's inside, or just keep me guessing?" Eliza looked down at it, her expression thoughtful. Then she knelt. "I think it's time you knew," she said. There was something in her tone, something final. Caleb straightened slightly, watching closely as she unlatched the case. The hinges creaked softly as the lid opened. Inside, order, precision, purpose. Glass tubes carefully secured in place. Small instruments Caleb didn't recognize. Metal tools, measuring devices, neatly bound notebooks filled with tight, deliberate handwriting. It didn't look like anything that belonged on a ranch. It looked scientific. Caleb blinked. What in the world? Eliza gently lifted one of the instruments, handling it with practiced care. "I studied agricultural science," she said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb stared at her. "You studied what?" She met his gaze. "Soil health, water conservation, crop rotation, sustainable grazing methods." Caleb let out a disbelieving breath, shaking his head. "You're telling me you're some kind of scientist?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I prefer farmer who learned the hard way." Caleb ran a hand across his jaw, trying to process it. That agency said you were a homemaker." "I am," Eliza replied calmly. "But that's not all I am." There was no pride in her voice, just truth. Eliza turned back to the ground, her focus shifting entirely. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the soil beneath them. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. She knelt, pressing her fingers into the dry earth, carefully collecting a small sample into one of the glass tubes. She added a few drops from a vial, shaking it gently before holding it up to the light. Caleb watched, completely out of his element. "What does that tell you?" he asked. Eliza studied the reaction in the tube. "That your land is exhausted," she said. "The nutrients are depleted. The soil structure is breaking down." Caleb frowned. "It's dirt. It's always been dirt." Eliza looked up at him. "No," she said softly. "So it's life. Or at least, it's supposed to be." She stood, brushing her hands off. "You've been grazing the same land continuously. The grass hasn't had time to recover. The roots weaken. The soil dries out faster. And without proper nutrients," she gestured around them, "everything begins to fail." Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's how my father did it," he said, "and his father before him." Eliza nodded. "And it worked, when the land could still sustain it." Her voice softened slightly. "But things change, Caleb. Weather patterns, soil resilience, even the demands we place on the land." He looked away, frustration rising. "So what? You're saying everything I've been doing is wrong?" Eliza shook her head. "I'm saying it's no longer enough." The distinction hung between them. Subtle, but important. But she walked a few steps forward, scanning the field again. "There's still hope," she said, "but not if we keep doing things the same way." Caleb crossed his arms. "And what exactly do you suggest?" Eliza turned back to him, a quiet fire in her eyes. "We start over." He let out a short laugh. "Start over? With what resources?" "With what we have," she replied, "and with what we can change." She began outlining her plan, not hesitantly, but with clarity. First, we divide the land into sections. Rotate the cattle so the grass has time to recover. Caleb frowned. That'll spread them thinner. It'll strengthen the land, she countered, which will strengthen the cattle. She continued. We adjust the watering system, focus on conserving what little we have instead of overusing it in one place. And how do we do that with a dying well? Eliza gestured toward the slope in the distance. There's natural runoff during storms. If we redirect it properly, we can retain more water. Caleb stared at her. You figured all that out just by looking? Eliza gave a small nod. And by knowing what to look for. Silence settled between them again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was shifting. Caleb glanced out over the land, the same land he had walked every day, fought for, nearly lost hope in. For the first time, he saw it differently. Not as something dying, but as something misunderstood. You really think this can work? He asked quietly. Eliza stepped closer. I know it can, she said. He searched her face for doubt. There was none. Why? He pressed. Why are you so sure? Eliza hesitated. For the first time since he'd known her, something flickered in her expression. Memory. Pain. My father lost everything to a drought, she said softly. He did everything the way he'd been taught. And it still wasn't enough. Caleb said nothing. I watched him try to fight it the same way, over and over, she continued, and I promised myself, if I ever had the chance. She looked up, her voice steady again. I'd do it differently. The weight of her words settled deep. Caleb exhaled slowly. So this is personal. Eliza met his gaze. Yes. The wind shifted again, moving across the land with a gentler touch than before. Caleb looked down at the open case, then back at her. Lam, you're asking me to trust something I don't understand, he said. Eliza nodded. Yes. He let out a slow breath. That's a big ask. I know. Another pause. Then quietly, but so is losing everything. That did it. Caleb looked out over the ranch one more time. The failing pasture, the thinning cattle, the life he was about to lose. Then back at Eliza, at her steady hands, her unwavering eyes, her impossible confidence. He shook his head slightly. This goes against everything I've ever known, he admitted. Eliza didn't respond. She just waited. Finally, Caleb let out a long breath. All right, he said. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture eased. We try it your way, he continued. But if this goes wrong, it won't, she said gently. Caleb raised a brow. Phew, you're very certain. Eliza closed the case carefully, securing the latch. Then she looked at him, calm, steady, unshaken. Not in me, she said. A small pause. In the one who gave me the knowledge. Caleb followed her gaze instinctively, to the horizon, where the sun had fully risen now, casting light across the land. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a losing battle. It felt like a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, an answer to a prayer he thought had come too late. Change didn't come like a miracle. It came like work. Hard, slow, uncertain work. The first morning of Eliza's plan began before sunrise. Caleb stepped outside to find her already in the field, marking sections of land with stakes and strips of cloth torn from an old feed sack. You're serious about this, he muttered, and walking up beside her. Eliza didn't stop tying the marker. We don't have time not to be. Caleb looked out across the pasture. The divisions she'd started mapping out cut the land into unfamiliar shapes, nothing like the wide, open grazing he'd always known. This is going to stress the cattle, he said. They're used to roaming. They're used to surviving, Eliza corrected gently. We're trying to help them live. Caleb frowned, but said nothing. That seemed to be happening more often. By mid-morning, they were moving cattle. It wasn't easy. The animals resisted at first, confused by the new boundaries, reluctant to leave the patches they knew, even if those patches were nearly barren. Caleb pushed harder than he meant to, frustration creeping into his voice. "Move!" he shouted, waving his arms, and the cattle shuffled reluctantly. Eliza stepped in beside him, not louder, not forceful, but steady. "Easy," she said. "They'll follow if we guide them, not drive them." Caleb shot her a look. "They're not exactly listening to reason." "Neither are you," she replied calmly. That stopped him. For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh. "All right," he said. "Show me." And she did. Patiently. Deliberately. She adjusted their movements, guiding the herd with a rhythm Caleb had never considered. It took longer, but the cattle settled more quickly once they reached the new section. Caleb watched them lower their heads, grazing cautiously. Then, more steadily. "They'll adjust," Eliza said. Caleb nodded slowly. "Let's hope we do too." The next task was water. Or, rather, the lack of it. The well sputtered weakly as Caleb tested it, the bucket coming up with barely enough to justify the effort. "We can't keep pulling from this like we have been," Eliza said, standing beside him. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. "What choice do we have?" She pointed toward the distant slope again. "When the storm comes, water flows down that ridge. Right now, it runs off and disappears." Caleb squinted. "There hasn't been a proper storm in months." Eliza met his gaze. "But when it comes, we need to be ready." They spent the afternoon digging, redirecting shallow trenches, reinforcing low points in the land where water could collect instead of vanish. The sun burned overhead, relentless. Sweat soaked through Caleb's shirt, his muscles aching with every movement. "See, this is a gamble," he muttered at one point, leaning on his shovel. "We're betting everything on rain that might not come." Eliza paused, catching her breath. "It's not just about rain," she said. "It's about being prepared when it does." Caleb shook his head. "You really believe all this is going to turn things around?" Eliza looked out over the work they'd done so far. Yes. There it was again. That certainty. Caleb didn't understand it, didn't fully trust it, but he couldn't ignore it either. Days passed. Long, exhausting days. The ranch became a place of movement and change, no longer stuck in the slow decline it had been trapped in for months. But change brought resistance, not just from the land, from Caleb himself. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of amber and fire, Caleb sat heavily on the porch steps, watching the divided pastures. "It still feels wrong," he admitted. Eliza sat beside him, hands resting in her lap. "What does?" "All of it," he said. "Breaking up the land, moving the cattle, trusting methods I've never seen work firsthand." Eliza nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Caleb glanced at her, surprised. "You're not going to argue?" "No," she said. "Doubt doesn't disappear just because we want it to." He looked back out at the land. "Then how do you keep going?" Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke softly. "Because I've seen what happens when people don't change." Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. He'd seen it too. That night, something shifted. Not in the land. In the house. Caleb woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. A voice. Soft. Steady. A praying. He sat up slowly, listening. Eliza's voice drifted through the thin walls, not loud, but clear enough to carry. Lord, you see this land. You see every crack in the soil, every struggling animal. Caleb swung his legs over the side of the bed, drawn by something he couldn't explain. But you also see what it can become, she continued. You are a God of restoration, of renewal, of resurrection. Caleb stepped closer to the door, his hand resting lightly against the frame. And if you can raise what was dead, Eliza whispered, then you can surely revive this place. Her words settled into the quiet like seeds. Give us wisdom, she prayed. Give us strength, and teach us to trust you, even when we don't understand the path. Caleb stood there long after her voice faded. Something in his chest felt different. Not fixed, but stirred. The next morning, he didn't say anything about what he'd heard, but he worked differently, listened more, argued less, and slowly, almost reluctantly, trusted more. A week later, the first signs appeared. Small, subtle, but undeniable. The section of land they had rested, left untouched, began to show hints of green. Not much, just enough to notice. Caleb crouched down, running his fingers over the new growth. How is this possible? He murmured. Eliza stood behind him, a quiet smile on her face. The land needed time to breathe, she said. Caleb shook his head in disbelief. I've been pushing it harder, thinking that would fix it. And sometimes, Eliza said gently, healing comes from rest. The words hit deeper than they should have. Caleb stood slowly, looking out over the divided pasture. So for the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. Fragile. Uncertain. But real. Still, the sky remained empty. No rain, no storm, just the same wide, endless blue. Caleb crossed his arms, staring up at it. We've done everything we can, he said quietly. Eliza stepped beside him. Not everything. He glanced at her. What's left? She looked up at the sky, then back at him. Faith. Caleb let out a slow breath. That's the hardest part. Eliza nodded. I know. They stood there together, side by side, facing a future that was still uncertain, still fragile, still one storm away from everything changing, or everything falling apart. But this time, they weren't just waiting. They were preparing, believing, and somewhere deep beneath the surface, the land, and perhaps even Caleb's heart, was beginning to come back to life. The air changed before the sky did. Caleb felt it the moment he stepped outside that morning. A heaviness, thick and charged, like the land itself was holding its breath. He paused on the porch, scanning the horizon. Clouds, dark ones. Not the thin, drifting kind that teased and disappeared, but dense, gathering, rolling in slow and deliberate waves from the distance. His jaw tightened. Storm's coming. Behind him, the door creaked open. Eliza stepped out, already dressed for the day, her eyes lifting immediately to the sky. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just watched. It's stronger than the others, Caleb said quietly. Eliza nodded. Yes. There was no fear in her voice, but there was awareness, the kind that understood both promise and danger. By midday, the wind had picked up. Not the dry, empty wind they were used to, but something sharper, alive, urgent. The cattle were restless, shifting, uneasy. Caleb moved quickly across the yard, checking the fences, reinforcing what he could. Eliza, he called. We need to secure the lower pasture. If this hits hard, it'll flood straight through there. Eliza emerged from the barn, her sleeves rolled, her expression focused. No, she said. Caleb turned sharply. "What do you mean, no?" "We don't fight it there," she replied, stepping toward him. "We move the cattle." "To where?" he demanded. She pointed toward the section they had restored, the carefully rotated land, slightly elevated, with trenches guiding potential runoff. There." Caleb hesitated. The wind whipped harder, tugging at his coat. "That pasture's not ready for all of them," he argued. "It's barely holding as it is." Eliza stepped closer, her voice steady despite the rising storm. "It's the only ground prepared to survive this." Thunder rumbled in the distance, low, ominous. Caleb looked from the sky to the land, then back to her. This was it, a decision. Trust everything she had taught him, or fall back on what he had always known. Another crack of thunder split the air, closer this time. Caleb clenched his jaw. "All right," he said. "We move them." The first drops of rain came fast, heavy, cold. They struck the ground like warning shots, kicking up dust that turned instantly to mud. Caleb and Eliza worked side by side, driving the cattle from the lower pasture, and the animals resisted at first, spooked by the thunder, confused by the urgency. "Come on!" Caleb shouted, his voice barely carrying over the wind. Eliza moved with calm precision, guiding the herd, redirecting their panic into movement. "Easy, easy," she murmured, her voice steady even as the storm began to roar around them. Lightning split the sky. The rain intensified, no longer scattered, but relentless. Within minutes, the lower pasture began to change. Water rushed in from the slopes, just as Eliza had predicted. Only now, Caleb could see it clearly. The way the land dipped. The way it pulled the water in like a basin. "We would have lost them," he muttered, realization hitting hard. Eliza didn't respond. She was focused on the last of the cattle. "Almost there," she called. The herd finally broke into the higher ground, a crowding into the restored pasture. Caleb swung the gate shut, just as the storm reached full force. Night fell early under the weight of the clouds. The storm raged without mercy. Rain pounded against the roof of the house like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. Wind howled through every crack and corner, rattling windows, slamming loose boards, testing the strength of everything Caleb had built. Or what remained of it. Inside, the lantern flickered weakly. Caleb stood near the window, staring out into the darkness. He could barely see anything beyond the sheets of rain. "It's too much," he said quietly. "If the water keeps rising." "It won't reach us here," Eliza said. He turned to her. "You don't know that." Eliza stepped closer, her voice calm. "I know the land we prepared." Another crash of thunder shook the walls. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, pacing. "This could destroy everything," he muttered. "Fences, fields." "And it could restore everything," Eliza said. He stopped, turned, looked at her like she'd said something impossible. "This?" He gestured toward the storm. "This is destruction." Eliza shook her head gently. "This is water," she said. "What we've been praying for." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't wrong. Hours passed. The storm did not let up. At some point, exhaustion forced them both to sit. Neither of them slept. Instead, they waited, listened, endured. At one point, Eliza bowed her head, her hands clasped tightly. "Lord, let this not be in vain," she whispered. "Let what we've prepared hold. Yet let what's been planted take root." Caleb watched her. Then, slowly, he bowed his head too. No words at first, just silence. Then, quietly, "Please." It wasn't much, but it was real. Morning came slowly. The storm had passed. but its presence lingered in every corner of the land. Caleb stepped outside first, his boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The air was different, cooler, full, alive. He walked forward cautiously, his eyes scanning everything. The lower pasture, flooded. Water pooled deep, cutting through the land exactly where Eliza had warned it would. Fences were down. Sections of earth had shifted. It would take time to repair. Caleb's chest tightened. Then he turned, looked toward the upper pasture, the one they had prepared, and froze. It stood untouched, not dry, but stable. And the trenches had worked. The water had been redirected, flowing around the pasture instead of through it. And the grass, it was greener, stronger, standing tall despite the storm. The cattle moved calmly, grazing, alive, safe. Caleb let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "You've got to be kidding me." Behind him, Eliza stepped into the yard. She followed his gaze, saw it all, and closed her eyes briefly, not in surprise, but in quiet gratitude. "It held," she whispered. Caleb turned to her, disbelief written across his face. "No," he said slowly. "It didn't just hold." He gestured toward the land. "It survived." A pause. Then, softer, his voice breaking just slightly. "You saved it." Eliza shook her head immediately. "No." She stepped forward, standing beside him. "I didn't." Caleb frowned. I watched you. I saw what you did. This," he pointed again, "this doesn't happen by accident." Eliza looked out over the land, her expression peaceful. "It doesn't," she agreed. Then she turned to him. "But it also doesn't happen without God." The words settled deeply. Caleb looked back at the pasture, at the life that had been preserved, at the land that had been given another chance, and for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel like he was fighting alone. The storm had come like judgment, but it had left behind something else. Proof that change was working, that faith wasn't empty, that what had been broken could still be restored. And as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the renewed land, Caleb Turner stood in the middle of it all, no longer just surviving, but beginning, finally, to believe. Easter morning arrived with a stillness that felt sacred, not empty, not heavy, but full, like the land itself was quietly rejoicing. A soft golden light spread across the ranch, touching everything it could reach. The grass in the restored pasture shimmered faintly with dew, each drop catching the sunrise like tiny sparks of promise. Caleb stood outside the house, hat in hand, breathing in the cool morning air. It was different now, cleaner, alive. He looked out over the land that had nearly slipped through his fingers. The lower pasture still bore the scars of the storm. Mud, broken fence lines, scattered debris. But it didn't look like defeat anymore. It looked like something being rebuilt. His gaze shifted to the higher ground. The pasture Eliza had restored. The one that had held. The one that had changed everything. The cattle grazed peacefully, stronger than they had been in months. Their movements were steady again, no longer desperate, no longer weak. Caleb swallowed hard. "I almost lost all of this," he murmured, "and now you haven't." He turned. Eliza stood a few steps behind him, dressed simply, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The morning light softened her features, but there was something stronger than light in her expression. Peace. Caleb nodded slowly. "Feels like I was standing at the edge of a cliff," he said. "Didn't even realize how close I was to falling." Eliza stepped beside him. "Sometimes we don't see the edge, until God pulls us back from it." Caleb glanced at her. You really believe that, don't you? She met his gaze, said, I've lived it. They stood in silence for a while, watching the sunrise climb higher. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, a clear, bright sound that seemed to echo across the open land. Caleb let out a slow breath. Today used to mean something to me, he admitted. Easter, I mean. Eliza tilted her head slightly. Used to? He nodded. My father never let it pass like any other day. Said it was the reason for everything. The reminder that even when things look dead, he gestured toward the land, they don't stay that way. Eliza smiled softly. He was right. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. I stopped believing that, he said. After he died, after everything started falling apart, it just felt like words. Eliza didn't interrupt, didn't try to correct him. She just listened. Caleb looked down at his hands. I thought I'd already lost what mattered, he continued quietly. So I stopped expecting anything good to come back. A pause. Then, almost reluctantly, guess I was wrong. Eliza's voice was gentle. Sometimes hope doesn't come back the way we expect it to. Caleb looked at her. No, he said. Sometimes it shows up in a stagecoach, carrying a wooden box and more faith than sense. Eliza laughed softly, her first real, unguarded laugh since arriving. I'll take that as a compliment. You should, Caleb replied. They began walking slowly across the yard, heading toward the pasture. Each step felt lighter than it had days before. Not because the work was done, but because it finally felt like it mattered. As they reached the edge of the restored land, Caleb stopped. There's something I need to say, he said. Eliza turned to him, attentive. Caleb took a breath. When I sent for a mail-order bride, it wasn't for the right reasons. Eliza didn't look surprised. I figured. He nodded. I wasn't looking for a partner. Wasn't thinking about building anything real. I just didn't want to lose everything. His voice lowered. I didn't expect you. Eliza held his gaze. What did you expect? Caleb let out a faint breath. Someone who needed saving, he admitted. A small smile touched Eliza's lips. And instead? Caleb's expression softened. I got someone who saved me. The words hung between them. Heavy. Honest. Eliza looked down briefly, then back up. I didn't come here to rescue you, Caleb, she said. I came because I believed God had a purpose in it. He nodded. Sure, and I think he did. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying the scent of damp earth and new growth. Caleb looked out over the land again, then back at her. I meant what I said before, he continued, about you staying. Eliza's expression grew still. Caleb, I know this wasn't what you expected either, he went on. This place, this situation, it's not exactly ideal. That's not what concerns me, she said softly. He paused. Then what does? Eliza hesitated. For something to last, it has to be built on the right foundation. Caleb understood what she meant. This isn't about convenience for you, he said, or survival. No, she replied. It isn't. A quiet moment passed. Then Caleb straightened slightly. Then let's build it right. Eliza searched his face. For real this time, he added. I'm not out of desperation, not out of fear, but with intention, with faith. They stood together in the soft morning light, and without planning it, without ceremony, they bowed their heads. Caleb spoke first. His voice was steady, but filled with something deeper than before. Lord, I don't have all the right words, he said, but I know what you've done here. He paused, emotion tightening his throat. You gave this land another chance. And you gave me one too. Eliza's voice followed, gentle but strong. Thank you for provision, for wisdom, for guiding every step, even the ones we didn't understand. Caleb took a breath. Help us not to forget this, he said. Not when things get hard again. Not when doubt tries to creep back in. Eliza added softly, and let everything we build from here honor you. They stood there a moment longer, then lifted their heads. The sun had fully risen now, casting warm light across the ranch. It wasn't perfect. Not yet. There were still fences to mend, fields to restore, work that would take weeks, months, maybe longer, but it wasn't dying anymore. It was living. Caleb looked at Eliza, something steady settling in his chest. So, he said, a faint smile forming, where do we start? Eliza glanced out over the land, then back at him. We keep going, she said, one step at a time. Caleb nodded. One step at a time. Side by side, they walked forward into the pasture, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners bound by purpose. And, as the wind moved gently through the renewed grass, carrying whispers of life and promise, the ranch stood as a testimony that what was once broken could be restored, that what seemed lost could be found, and that sometimes the answer to a desperate prayer doesn't come too late. It comes exactly when it's needed most.